So we're going to talk about what's new in Android. If you recognize the title of this talk, it may be because we gave a talk eerily similar to this before. If you saw that talk at Google I/O, you may find some of the material today eerily similar to what we said back in May. That's because we gave out a preview release that thankfully was pretty representative of the final release of M, which finally came out very recently. We have added, when I say we, it's the royal we, because there's only one of me up here. We've added a bit of information to talk about stuff that has happened since that preview release, so I'll go over that. In the meantime, I would like to introduce my co-speaker. Unfortunately, he decided that he couldn't join me. He actually got really sick the night before he was going to come out here and bailed yesterday. So originally, Dan Sandler was going to join me for a reprise of our talk that we did, and then Dan bailed on me for some pathetic excuse like work, and then Romain was going to join me instead as a stand-in, and he was going to fake a Boston accent. That didn't work either. So now it's just me pretending that I don't have a problem and that everybody actually wants to be here but just couldn't. So I love this post on the BBQ site where apparently I now have like a Catholic name. It's Chet Hoswamagi, and that's the person that won't be joining me. So on with the show. First of all, one of the things that's new since I/O, obviously, is some of the new hardware that we have. So the Nexus devices just came out, the 5X and the 6P. Actually, so has anybody actually seen, held, bought these things yet? Okay, I'm going to claim a majority, although I think I saw 7 hands. Actually, the availability was very recent, right? You could do a pre-order. I don't know if they're actually delivering yet. 5X, oh, cool, okay. I'm on the inside, I don't know the details on the outside. So I was gonna go over quickly some of the specs here, some of the more interesting stuff. Quality camera, we'll see some pictures later. I'm not a good photographer, but I was surprised. I took a picture of a sunrise. I thought there was sort of some interesting reds, and it actually came out with a really crisp detail at a fairly dark point in the morning. So that was sort of my first alert that like the sensor's a lot bigger. You can get a lot more light in there and do a lot more with it. We'll talk a little bit about fingerprint stuff that's enabled on these devices. USB Type-C. We'll mention some of the specs here. So I actually prefer the 5X just because I like the smaller form factor. It's a little bit taller than the Nexus 5. But in the meantime, it's got faster hardware. So it's got the, what do they call it? The Hexa core. Hexa being some language for 6, so we have 4 little cores and then 2 mega cores. So fairly good performance on the CPU side, upgraded GPU from the Nexus 5, fairly substantial battery in there. On the 6P side, much larger display, a little bit smaller than the Nexus 6, which was too big for me. This is a little bit smaller, easier to handle with one hand. Again, upgraded GPU and CPU from what we saw before, including the octa-core. So we've got 4 little cores and then 4 big cores when we need to run something really substantial on there. So on the camera, lots of numbers, not all of which make sense to me. So 4K video, slow motion capture, I played with that the other day, interesting. Double click on, I don't know if anybody's seen this feature yet in the camera app. If you double click when the screen is off, it'll automatically launch into the camera. Or even if you're logged into the phone, if you double click, it'll go to the camera immediately. It's sort of a quick way to get into kind of a common use case that people had, so you don't have to turn the phone on and then do the thing that you want. Meanwhile, fairly large resolution pictures that come out of it, fairly large pixel size, and large sensor area, so we get a lot more light coming into the camera. So here are some sample pictures taken by a much better photographer. I asked Romain Guy. I always find when I want to put pictures in a presentation of mine, it's much easier to just steal them from Romain, who knows how to take pictures. So these are some that he took around the office and home the other day, sort of demonstrate various things, including I wanted to end on an American flag because Texas. Let's see. So Nexus Imprint. This is actually my favorite feature about these devices. The really cool thing is the way I store my phone in my pocket is usually face down, upside down, and as I take it out of my pocket, I put my finger in the fairly cleverly placed location, and then by the time I'm looking at the phone, it's actually unlocked and on. So it's just kind of a nice sort of quick power on thing. It can also be used to authenticate your applications that you write, and we'll go over a little bit of that later. I haven't used those applications yet. I'm not a pay user right now, but it's kind of huge for me just having the unlock feature. USB, I find this kind of cool. I don't know if anybody else goes through this. With the normal sort of USB, the micro USB adapter, I always have to go through 3 efforts to plug it in, right? So you try it, and that didn't fit, so it must be upside down. And then you turn it over, and you try it again, and in fact, that was wrong, and you were right the first time, so then you turn it over and then insert it correctly the 3rd time. So USB-C, saving 2 efforts on every plug-in. Thank you very much. Okay, let's talk about Android 6, Marshmallow. Here's a picture of the little guy outside freezing at, I don't know, 5:30 in the morning when I got there that day. First of all, runtime permissions. So who's actually enabled their app for runtime permissions so far? A few of you, good. More would be better. So this is something that users as well as developers have asked for a long time. I think the trick is that it does mean some growing pains, right? Because now, well, A, you need to do a little bit more work to actually opt into this thing, but also you need to handle conditions that couldn't come up before, because users may actually deny that permission to your application, or they may not want that permission granted, and you actually need it. So there may be a little bit more interaction that's required the user to explain why this thing is needed so that they understand. On the other hand, we now no longer have this set of blanket permissions that the user is faced with when they install your application. Why is it that your chat application needs my camera? Why is it that your game needs to know where I am? Some of these things don't make sense and shouldn't have been there in the first place, frankly. Some of these things make perfect sense in the context of the application, but it's hard to gauge that when you're just faced with this huge list of permissions when you want to download and install the application. So it's much more granular and explanatory now. So this is the traditional model, and this is still the model that people will see on pre-M releases. So I need the following things, and then you have no choice. You're like, well, either I'm going to give you all these permissions, or I'm not going to install your application. And if you want the application, you kind of got to do it. In the new world, instead, you ask for permission when you need it, when a particular permission needs to be granted in order for you to perform some function like, actually using the camera or using the location, then you ask the user for that. Once they've granted the permission, you have it. You do not have to ask for it again. On the other hand, the user can deny things at any point. You can go into settings and look at all the permissions that are used by all the applications and disable these selectively, which means that your application, especially if you wrote it pre-M and you haven't touched the code since, may be denied a permission that you thought was there because when it was installed, that permission was there. So we have a mechanism internally to throw an exception or an error when you don't get that exception, and hopefully your code is robust enough to handle that. But if you're re-attacking this with the M runtime permissions, then you want to be able to handle that intelligently. And you want to also be able to give the user a little bit more information when it's necessary. I'm not sure if I show the flow there. Let's see. No, let me go back. So one of the things that helps is there's sort of a to-ask policy. So we'll ask the user, and if you think, well, this permission will be granted, there's no reason why they wouldn't let me have access to the camera, because obviously it's a photo booth application, right? So you pop up the permission, and the user says, no, I don't want this. Okay, well, we allow you to ask again as the application, but that second time we ask, we're going to also include a checkbox that says never ask me again, because otherwise it's like you're spamming the user every time you ask for this thing. But maybe before you pop up that permission again, you can say, okay, we need access to the following thing because we have this feature called a camera, and this is an application called a photo booth, so maybe you actually want to enable this permission. And once you think the user actually understands why you're asking for the permission, then go ahead and tell us to expose that dialog again. We'll pop it up. Hopefully they do the right thing, and you can go on about your business. So these permissions, everything you're asked for, but the app actually has to deal with it. I went over a lot of that stuff. We'll keep going. There is a compat API now, so you can access this in the support library. There's a couple of resources for more information. First of all, there was permissions in M session at Google I/O. It followed the What's New in Android talk that we gave back in May. That's on YouTube, so go ahead and search for it by that title, and Ben Poise explains a lot more of the details of how and why this thing works. And also, we had Ben on the podcast. Actually, I'm curious, how many people know about the Android Developers Backstage podcast? Because this is like one of those secrets. You sort of do this thing, and you ship it out to the world, and you have no idea how many people or who actually knows this thing exists. So it's a podcast that I do with Tor Norby from the Tools team, where we interview mostly Google people, not exclusively. It just happens to be easier to walk down the hall than it is to email somebody externally and organize that. So we talk to a lot of Android developers basically about how stuff works, either internally or externally. So we had Ben on to talk more in depth about permissions, so you can check out that episode if you want to know more of the internals and how to actually interact with permissions. Voice interaction, so we had the capability already to have an intent launched with a voice action. Now there's interaction, so you can actually interact with the user after they launch your intent. So you specify this intent, and you say, I'm going to be launched on voice actions, and you could already say, well, if it's a voice interaction, do the following thing. But now you can actually go back to the user and get some clarifying information. So you can say, okay, given the following string, go ahead and do a text-to-speech thing and say this to the user to get some more information, and then when you've got that information, launch my confirm implementation. And once I've got that, then I have the following clarifying information. So basically, they said something that launched your app. You respond, asking some clarifying question. They respond to that. Then you get that additional information. You can go on about your business. Fingerprint, again, my personal favorite feature of the new devices with that capability. You have the ability to pop up your own user interface for fingerprint authentication. So there's APIs where you can get the information from the sensor and say, okay, have they authenticated that they are the correct user with the fingerprints that are stored on the device, and you can have your own UI to help the user understand what they're doing and what the result of that was. Or you can use the standard UI by calling create confirmed device credential intent. That's a mouthful right there. That's a lot of characters. I think you're going to wrap the line just with the method name there. So you can have us pop up the normal lock screen UI to ask the user to authenticate that way as well. There's a couple of samples that are good to check out there on the d.android.com site, the fingerprint dialog as well as the confirm credential. And there's an I/O byte, the fingerprint and payments APIs. This was a sandbox talk at I/O, and then they recorded it as an I/O byte, so you can search for that title name and you'll find Maya talking about this. We also, secret for the people in the room that nobody outside this room knows until the video is posted in an hour, is that we've had a conversation with some of the fingerprint people on the podcast as well, so hopefully that'll come out sometime soon. We'll see. Android backup. So you could always back up everything. Sorry, not everything. You could back up a bunch of stuff. We would back up things about your accounts so that when you restored onto a different device or installed your account on a different device, we would pick up some of those sort of common account settings, you know, the Wi-Fi routers that you could connect to or whatever. But now we actually back up basically everything except temp and cache directory information. So when you target the MSDK, we will back up all your stuff automatically for free and store it in the cloud. And then you can opt out of that if you want. So there's a simple way of opting out using include and exclude tags in an XML file. So in your resource directory, in the XML directory, you would create this backup scheme.xml file that you refer to in your manifest, and then you give us include or excludes. By default, everything's included. If you give us an include or a set of includes, then only those things will be included. Or if you give us excludes, then only those things will be excluded from the full set. And then additionally, you can just tell us to not back up anything. If that's just not something you want to do, that's fine. Google Play Services, we recently released 8.1, I believe. So back at I/O, we talked about the thing that I think is still pretty critical for people to key into, which is GCM Network Manager. This is kind of the Google Play Services equivalent of Job Scheduler. And in fact, when you're running on a release that has Job Scheduler as part of the framework, it'll use that internally. But it's the same idea and APIs for basically saying, I want to do things when it's appropriate. So I want to do this when the device is plugged in, or when I have high bandwidth data, or when I have Wi-Fi, all of these things, so that you're not constantly syncing or syncing at times that are totally inappropriate for the user experience or the device capabilities or the data plan or whatever. There's a bunch of other stuff that's been added also in Google Play Services 7.5, as well as the releases since then. Nearby came out over the summer. Again, we had a chat with those folks on the podcast if you want some of the inner details of that sort of close proximity communication between devices to set up things like passing tokens back and forth to get everybody on the game dashboard or whatever. Mobile vision, the ability to do face detection as well as barcode scanning. The new permissions model, there's some Marshmallow permissions APIs in the more recent Google Play Services stuff. Maps can come up now in ambient modes. I don't know if people have noticed the ambient mode on the new devices sort of comes up with this simple and cheaper sort of black and white screen to give you the basic information. Then you can go launch into the full color screen if you want. Player stats, app invites, more information on the blogs that were posted about Google Play Services, so check those out. So battery, turns out that battery continues to be an issue, and probably will continue to be an issue after this as well, because basically apps are doing more and more. The more capabilities that a device has, the more apps want to take advantage of that. You know, they want their data all the time. Then we have a problem on the device, because if all the applications are doing lots of stuff all the time, then pretty soon you're going to drain the battery. So we work really hard at the platform level, and we encourage apps to work hard at the application level as well to reduce the amount of drain overall. So there were a couple of major things that we did in the release, and people with M devices will notice this, especially if you have your device not being used for a while, then it's going to drain the battery far less than you expected it to, because we've got this thing called doze mode. So if it's basically sitting on a counter somewhere not moving, we're using the sensors to detect whether the device is actually being used. And if it's not, then why are we doing anything? So we'll go into a deep sleep mode where we're not syncing anything. We will still wake up for the important things if you have an alarm scheduled or whatever, but we're not really, the background apps aren't going out and getting a bunch of data, which is frankly not going to be used if the user is not actually using their device at the time. So we've got doze mode. We've also got app standby mode, which is more at the application level, where we will notice that an application has not been used for some amount of time, several days or whatever. Then why is that app continuing to sync? Right? If I haven't actually used my Reader app in 4 weeks, why is it going out and retrieving sync points in the books that I'm reading on a different device? There's no reason for that. So we'll notice that, and then we'll restrict the data usage of that particular app so that it's not constantly running and syncing in the background, draining your battery for absolutely no reason whatsoever. We have assistant support. This is the now on tap stuff that you may have seen at Google I/O. There's the ability for your application to provide more information, more contextual information. So there's some APIs that you can opt into here, override on provide assist data, on provide assist content, and provide more information back to the system so that we can give the user even more context for how to use your application, given the information that was on the screen at the time. Data binding. So this is a big thing that we did in the UI area. It's basically a way to save the developer from writing a lot of boilerplate code. So it's not doing anything fundamentally new. It's just doing it in a way where we do the work instead of you. So if you imagine in a UI, there's usually a lot of listeners in the system. You're setting up, you're creating these setters and getters and listeners and sending messages all around. And a lot of that is done because basically the user did an action over here which needs to propagate to another item over there. You're dragging a progress bar and you want to update a text view somewhere, a label with the value of that progress bar, or the data itself changed and you want that information to be displayed in the UI somehow. Well, now you can actually connect those dots through data binding and we'll automatically propagate that for you. Let's take a look at a tiny little example. So you may have a simple app, you have some image views and text views that are based on information from some data that you're getting over the network or off disk or whatever. So we have a new kind of layout tag called layout. And inside the layout tag goes all of the information that you used to put for your view hierarchy. So the old, the layout.xml file or that goes in the layout resource directory, that stuff still goes in there, and you can see this in the slide in the frame layout tag, normal view hierarchy stuff. But in addition to that, we also have a data area of the layout where you declare the variables that are going to be used by data binding in the rest of the file. So we say, well, we've got a variable named item, and here is the class that it refers to, and then we have the items below that refer to it, and say, well, we want the source of the image to be the value of this image field in this item, and it'll go in and create or use the getters and setters as necessary in there. And then for the text view, we want the information in there to come from the item itself. But notice it's not just simply grabbing a field. We also have some basic syntax in there that you can use to make an expression in there. So here we're actually formatting it and saying make a string out of the following values, and then display that in the text view instead. So then we get the $ and dollars and cents in there. So again, fairly straightforward in what it's doing, but there's a lot of stuff going on under the hood. In particular, a lot of systems like this could be written using reflection. Okay, well, they told us to go look for this thing, so then at runtime, you're going in the class and you're looking for a field with this name or a getter and setter with this name. But instead, we do pre-processing. So we take this layout file and we create the glue code, all the classes that are going to be doing the monitoring for the changes in data and the getters and setters that are necessary and the listeners. We create that for you so that at runtime, we actually just send the information through the normal mechanism that you would do if you wrote optimal code to do this. So it's very straightforward. There's no reflection used in the system. It's all done at build time. Most of the functionality is actually in the tool in Android Studio, and then there's a little bit of support in the support library with the classes that you need to implement to observe some of the information going on. There was a sandbox talk at I/O, which was not recorded, but there was recently another talk at a meetup on data binding, and I think we're going to have a talk at an upcoming conference as well. So there should be some recorded talks by the folks who worked on that. Also, we had them, again, I don't want to keep plugging the podcast. I'm just trying to think of the resources that we have for this stuff. We had Yeet and George on a recent version of the podcast talking about that as well. So some of the UI features that we had in addition to data binding, we had a whole bunch of stuff around what we call the design library. The design library was basically us saying, well, there was a whole lot of stuff in the material spec that we asked developers to implement so that they could have applications that look consistent on the platform, and we thought they were good UI practices and good UI experiences for people to have, and in the meantime, you're on your own. So we took a step back and said, okay, what are some of the common patterns that we're telling developers to implement, which we could help them out with? So we created a bunch of smaller classes and UI widgets that developers can now just use to get a consistent look and feel with everybody else using those same widgets. At the top of that hierarchy is coordinator layout, which is you wouldn't use directly, but it's basically the Chrome that everybody plugs into for these other pieces. It's sort of the thing sitting at the top. If you want to have the snack bar, you need to sort of plug it in at the top of a hierarchy, not just have it hanging out in space. Or if you want the fab to sort of live somewhere standard, all this stuff is plugging into the coordinator layout, kind of the architect of the rest of these things. We have the snack bar, we have tab layouts, we've got the navigation view, just standard UI patterns that we've been talking about for a while, but we encapsulated them into these standard widgets in the support library so that everybody can use these. And because it's in the support library, you can use those on releases prior to M as well. Text input layout, so it gives you more information about the text that's being expected in that field. And then the fab. And we always thought, the question came up while we were in development in the L release about, well, should we release a fab widget? And we decided not to because A, it's not straightforward. It's not like you're going to have a fab widget and it's going to do everything you want. It's, well, where do you want that fab widget to live? Like, what is the container that it actually lives in, since it's sort of overriding several of them? So that was a little more complicated, now solved by the coordinator layout thing. But also, it was like, well, it's a circle. It's a circle with a drop shadow. How hard is this thing? Turns out it was trickier for some people. And in particular, it was also inconsistent. People would pick different elevations or different ways of displaying the shadows, or they would have circles that were of different sizes. So we thought maybe it's better if we actually just come out with a standard widget so that everybody has the same notion of what a fab is. So there it is, the fab. Sorry, I should say, you work with UX, and they use a lot of acronyms and buzzwords, which if you're not in the design group, you have no idea what they're talking about. So I worked with them for several months, and I kept hearing them say fab, 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 fab. And then finally, I just started saying fab. Floating action button. All right? Everybody clear on that? All right. Floating action button. Stop talking like a designer. All right. Other UI changes. So recycler view, swipe to dismiss. There's a nice interaction point there. If anybody has tried to make this work in list view, not straightforward. Same thing with drag and drop. I know because we did videos explaining how to do this in list view. One of the whole goals with Recycler View was to give developers and users something out of the box that just kind of did what you wanted, as opposed to giving you the framework and the plumbing, and then you're on your own with this fairly complex widget, which resulted in people doing it in different ways or simply not doing it because it was a complicated problem to solve. So Recycler View came along. It's much more pluggable and flexible with a lot of built-in behaviors like animations for the simple, straightforward operations. And then we've been adding things to it since. So drag and drop and swipe to dismiss are two of those. And then more recently in the 23.1 release, which came out last week, we took another run at item animations. In particular, we got the request from some people that it was difficult to do a richer animation when the content was changing. There was a built-in animation where you could say, okay, the following item changed, and then we would replace the old view with a new one, and we would do a crossfade between them. That's reasonable, but if your views are very rich and expensive, you didn't necessarily want to create a new view for that thing. Additionally, you might want a richer animation to animate, the text into its new location or a color change or whatever. So with the new content animations, you have the ability to override and do something custom all on your own. And in addition to that, you can actually use the same view. So we're not necessarily going to replace the holder if you don't want us to. We can have you reuse that holder, and you can animate the stuff around however you want. In WebView, they have the ability to now render off-screen, which is helpful in the particular situation of you want to animate something on screen and you don't want it to be drawing at the same time as it's doing that. So you can pre-draw it using more memory to do that off-screen and then animate it in. Notifications. So there was a new class added called Icon, which is basically a holder for several different kinds of information. It can be a resource ID or a bitmap or a byte array. This is basically about having a more optimal way to hold the information so that we're not constantly recreating it along the fly. If you're passing around in notifications, if you're passing around a resource ID and then it needs to get inflated by this part of the system and then passed over to this other process that then inflates that resource ID, like everybody's going through the same work over and over again. So instead we have this holder structure that holds whatever representations are most optimal. So you can create it with a resource. That's one of the ways that you can use this thing. But you can also create it with a bitmap. So this could be handy if you have resources that indicate information that can be variable over time. So Dan's example, when we talked about this at I.O., was a weather application may have different icons for different temperatures. Well, since we only allowed you to create notifications from resources before, then you would actually have to have assets representing all the different possible combinations of temperatures, which could be a lot if you don't live in California or Hawaii. And so instead, you could actually create those dynamically now, and then you can create this icon class with the bitmap instead of the resource ID. So you don't need to have any of these available at build time. Instead, they can be generated at runtime whenever you need them. We had some changes in text, mostly in the UI area. So the way that you select text is much more natural and powerful now. So you've got the text handles as before, but now as you drag them out, they expand by word instead of always by character. And then as you contract, it contracts by character. So you can still select the same amount, the same granularity as you could before, but common selection operations should be much easier and more fluid to the user. In addition to that, you'll notice the floating palette there. Prior to this change, when you selected text, we would indicate what you could do, the actions that you could do with that text up in the action bar, which on a phone is not a big deal. On a tablet is a much bigger deal, right? Because you may be selecting text way down here, and the actions pop up in a place that's not even necessarily in your view. So now we have this floating action palette instead that pops up next to the area that you've just indicated you want to work with. We also have the ability to process that text, so you can have an intent launched when the user indicates that they want to do something with that text. So you could have, say, a translation service that can take the text that was selected, and that'll be passed into your intent, and you can change that to whatever you want to and pass that back to the user. So check out that API for more information there. And we also have higher quality text formatting. This is sort of an ongoing concern. How can we make our text higher quality in general? One of those ways is by providing better breaking. So this means, figuring out how long all the words are and then breaking appropriately so that we don't have, this really staggered thing on the right that looks rather awkward. And a big part of that was enabling hyphenation, which, after having had many conversations with the text people in my group, it's a lot harder problem than you think it would be. There's like standard data where people expose how to break different words, and if you think about, well, I kind of know how syllables work in English, I don't know how they work in other languages, especially languages that are maybe left to right or have a completely different representation of characters and ligatures and, characters that get built up, together into single characters. It's very, very complicated. So we're on our way to solving that. There's still some other internationalization support that we're working on, but in the meantime, we may have much higher quality text breaking and hyphenation as part of that. We also have the ability in static layout to set indents, so you can set it to a shaped path. So you can see here we've got the nice round text. This turns out to be also a hard problem to solve, but we've basically just got a really simple way for you to say, this is the indents that I want in this particular area that I have. App linking, it's possible for you now when the user selects a link to launch your application. And this happens through a combination of your application that's installed on the device as well as your website, your domain out there, because it's going to be a handshake between the two of them. So you have this JSON file that has the information about the thing that should be launched and certificate information so that we know, all the right information is being shared between the right parties here. So we have this asset links.json with the information about the app that should be launched. And then we've got something in the manifest on the device side that says, okay, here's the URL that it refers to. And we have auto verify equals true, so sort of this handshake between the two, your domain out there, your device over here, and then we know at install time, we'll go and look for that file, look for the information, and know, okay, when the user goes to that website, here's the application that I'm going to launch instead. And then the user can change this in settings if they want. Direct share. This is the ability for an application to share deeper links within an application instead of just the application itself. So if you're interacting with a particular user in a chat application, maybe it would make sense to share information about a chat with that particular user instead of just a chat application overall. So you say, well, here's a chooser service that I'm going to implement. So when it needs to, it'll launch that chooser service that you implemented, and it'll ask you, are there other targets that I should choose for you when they want to go into some let's say the chat target. And then you can expose different information there. So you can say not just launch the Hangouts application, for example, but launch it to one of these particular users that they chat with frequently. We have stylus support. We always had stylus support to some extent. But it was particular stylus devices. It was something that was plugged in there. Now we have Bluetooth stylus support, and we have some new events that go along with it. In particular, we have the button stylus primary and button stylus secondary. Button stylus primary equates to the button secondary in earlier releases. So if you want to track the same event prior to M, you can certainly do that. But if you want to track the stylus event directly in M, then use the stylus primary. This is because the button press, we still want to track, when the user presses on the screen, we want to know that that's actually a touch event as opposed to a stylus event. So that's the primary event is button press primary. And then button press secondary is an alias to the button stylus primary. And then you can have things like the click drag gesture so they can select that thing and drag it on the screen with the stylus. Let's see, graphics. Let's talk about graphics. We have something in the camera. So it used to be that if you wanted to turn on the flashlight, you would grab the camera just to enable the flashlight, which seems like a lot of work to go through just to light up the closet when you're in there at night. So instead, we no longer require that. You can actually turn on the flashlight without grabbing the mutex of the camera and wasting a lot of battery in the meantime. And then there's a simple API that you can use there. Alpha optimization. So this gets into some of the perf matter stuff that Colt likes to talk about. When you are fading out a view or setting alpha on a view, if that view is complicated, usually optimal for you to create a layer for that view, so that we draw it once to that layer, and then we simply fade that layer. So for instance, if you're running a fading animation, if you're fading in a view or fading it out, it would be typical to use the animate API. So you'd say view.animate.with layer, and that tells us to build a layer, and then you animate alpha to fade it in, and then the layer gets torn down when we're done. We basically do that for you automatically now. So when we notice that you're setting alpha on a layer, we will create, or alpha on a view, we'll create a layer for you. And this saves us from, if you imagine what the alpha operation is, the way alpha has to work is that we have to draw that view the way we normally do, so opaquely, to an external buffer, and then when we're done with that thing, we copy it in translucently. It's not good enough for us to draw all of the individual operations translucently. It's a little hard to explain. I could use a whiteboard and show you, but we can't do that, which means that's the cheap way to do it, and we can't use it. Instead, we create a buffer, draw everything, copy it in, destroy the buffer. Huge wasted effort on every single frame. It's much better to create the buffer once, use it for all the frames that you wanted, and then tear down the buffer. So that's what we do. When we set alpha, we automatically create a layer for you, and then we use that from then on. It's still better for you to do it because you know more about how that view is being used, how your animation is being run, and the timing that you want. When we first notice that alpha is non-opaque, that's when we create the layer, which means that you may take a hit on that first frame as we're going to the effort of creating the buffer. So you may rather take that hit at a different time when the user's not going to notice. So still use the set layer type or the with layer in view property animator, but if you don't, we'll try to do the right thing in the platform. In the audio area, the big change was MIDI. So you could already do MIDI if you wanted, but you were kind of on your own, right? You could receive all the information through USB, and you could do whatever you wanted with it. But now we have classes and capabilities that we built for you to make this a lot easier. And we also made it two-directional. So not only do you have the ability for someone to play a device into the Android device and send in the note information and velocity and which channel they're playing, and then you could play it from your application. If you have some sample, some sound database, then you could actually play those samples based on the note information that was coming into the Android device. But now you also have the ability to send the information out, so you could have a keyboard on the Android device sending the note information out, playing those samples from the external sample device. So both sides of that, so check out MIDI Device Manager and MIDI Device Service to know how to interact with those. In tools, there's been a bunch of stuff coming up to I/O, but also since then. So the 1.4 release came out recently. And we have the ability to actually do stuff with vector drawables. So you can visualize vector drawables in the tool now. And you can also take a look at a lot of standard SVG files and import those or export those as vector drawables. And I think save those as image files as well. So a lot more flexibility in how you can deal with vector art in your application. And also design library templates. So there's a lot more templates in there that you can use for standard design patterns that use some of the design library components that I was talking about earlier. There's a theme editor. Right now it currently only handles colors, but allows you to see the color palette that's being used and interact with that and change that. GPU and network monitors, these are cool. There's a lot of new functionality that's being integrated into the tool that allows you to get the kinds of information that Cole likes to talk about in his videos. In particular, this gives you the information. If you look up at the top one, that is eerily similar to what you can already get on the device if you enable GPU profiling. You get these colored bars on the screen that give you information about how long it took us to process the drawing commands, how long it took us to send the information to OpenGL, how long it took us to get the buffer back from OpenGL. That information is now propagated back to the host, and you can see it in real time in the GPU monitor. And in the network monitor, you can see how much information is going in and out of the device from your application. There, we got Firebase integration for people that are really into databases. Yes, yes. Not me either. 1.5, I'm sorry, it's terribly important. It's just, I'm just not a data person. 1.5, this is cool, heap dump analysis. There's been a couple of cool things about this recently. It used to be, if you wanted to find leaks, important things like activity leaks, which I may or may not admit to having introduced at some points in my past. Ask me sometime about leak hash map. What you would do is you would take a heap dump. So there's something in Android Monitor or DDMS where you could say, take a heap dump. You typically like GC, and then take a heap dump, and then you would convert that heap dump, and then you would run a tool like Mat, which is a Eclipse standalone or plugin thing that you can run, and then you would get a ton of information that you would then try to sort of wade through. It's like systrace for memory. Right? You would wade through this information to figure out like what existed that I did not expect, like 7 instances of my activity. And then you would trace it back to the root set and say, okay, why did it exist? Who is referring to this thing that I thought went away? Turns out the answer is a static hash map. So instead, there's a couple of new tools that are worth mentioning. One is an external tool called Leak Canary. Have people heard of this thing? Again, we talked to the guy at Square, PY, or Pierre-Yves. He goes by PY because apparently Americans can't pronounce his name. Who wrote Leak Canary, and it's code that you inject in your application. Please don't ship with it. Use it for your debug version. I've seen applications ship with it, and it's ugly. And it tells you, it basically monitors the things that go away, and if they don't, it warns you. It pops up I think a toast on the system and says, oh, by the way, you just leaked your activity. That's a great tool. I would encourage you to use that. We also have the ability now in Android Studio to do some leak analysis at a deeper level, and it has information specifically about Android, like activity leaking. So go ahead and run this. So this is sort of, it's more similar to Mat, sort of the full-on, here's all the information about references in your system, but it has information that's specific to Android. So it's more focused and domain-specific than Mat is. Data binding, there's integration of fairly straightforward stuff like syntax highlighting, so it knows what the language is the data binding is using. And new lint checks, because there's always new lint checks. Systrace, we saw a little bit of this in Colt's keynote earlier. Very simple UI, one of my favorites. It's obvious what's going on from this trace. The new thing here, so there's a couple of new things. There's events up at the top. There's a bunch of little circles under the green information, like the second row up there. And also I wish there was a laser pointer in here. I'm going to point with this anyway. So the circle is right in the middle of the screen where there's like a bunch of red ones and then a bunch of greens. Those are basically tips. So you can click on those now. If you ever looked at Systrace and said, I don't know what to do with this, nor do I know the people that wrote Android, so I can't do anything with this information. Now you can click on these tips and they're going to give you a little bit deeper information about what we actually saw that was problematic when your application was running. So I clicked on that tip there, and it said, list view item recycling involved inflating views. Ensure your adapter get view recycles the incoming view instead of constructing a new one. I believe this was a trace from the I/O scheduling application last year, and they took the frame rate down up from horrible to good. I think just by this. And you'll find actually if you use Systrace and click on the tips, a lot of the tips are the same, because you probably have the same problem occurring over and over again. Moreover, once you fix some of these fundamental problems, you'll find a lot of the overall performance goes up, because usually there's just a couple of outlier things like running inflation on the UI thread while an animation is going, or something like this where you actually weren't reusing the view when you should have. So there's some simple stuff that we're now checking for internally. So I would encourage you to go back to Systrace. If you gave up because it was just too hairy, go back to it now and see whether it can help you understand what's going on with the performance. And then there's also a summary panel over on the right that sort of details all the different kinds of problems there were. And again, there are not usually an infinite number of problems. Instead, there are probably an infinite number of symptoms caused by a very few number of problems. So you can sort of see the tally of what's going on from what we could tell from our analysis. There were improvements in art, basic optimization. This is what the art team does. They keep making a run at it, making things faster. If you go to the talk that I'm giving tomorrow morning, I believe, Android for Java developers, I'm going to talk specifically about memory concerns there, and we go into a fair amount of detail about how the garbage collector works both in Dalvik and Art. So there's more information about some of that side, which I find kind of interesting. There's a new API in Art. You can get some of the runtime stats. There's a lot of documentation in the debug class where you can look up information about all the information that you can get there. There's some other grab bag stuff that we wanted to mention and couldn't really categorize. You can adopt external storage now. You should avoid hard-coded paths because if the user can adopt a different location for the data, you better not depend on it being where you thought it was. We give you all the tools for this already to be able to query dynamic paths at runtime, and that's what you should use instead. Also, if you don't have permanent storage in your device to actually test this out with your application, we would encourage you to test it anyway. So you can plug in a USB drive and then use the following ADB command to force us to adopt this rather non-adoptable temporary storage just for the purposes of testing here. Also, it's important to point out that Apache HTTP went away. We deprecate APIs, but we generally don't remove things because it's a bit of a growing pain for developers, and we don't want to crash apps out there. And let's be clear, we still didn't actually remove it from the runtime. So if you're an old app still using Apache HTTP, it will still run. It's just that the API is hidden. You could not build against it now. But I think we said back in 2011 that people should stop using this, and then we finally hid the API this year. So it takes a while, but gall darn it, we mean it. So you should use HTTP URL connection instead. Boring SSL replaces OpenSSL. Who in this room knows what I'm talking about when I say that? 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, okay, all right. I shouldn't have raised my hand, actually. I don't really use these APIs. And finally, I would encourage you to check out a series of articles that we published on medium.com. This actually came from an internal effort that we had. We talked to internal app developers who said, we keep talking to the framework team and finding out that we're doing things wrong. Or we'll ask a question about how to do something, and the answer will be, no, don't do it that way, or obviously you should have used a layer there, or don't do that on the UI thread, or why are you churning garbage? So we have all these things in our minds, and the apps teams didn't. And it turns out one of the problems was because a lot of the internal app developers at Google, and probably like the rest of the world, came from a world of developing Java that was quite different. It is the same programming language, but it is not necessarily the same environment. If you write Java programs for a server, and then you try to use those same patterns and approaches to write a mobile application, you will suffer for it, right? Because we do not have the same kind of constraints on mobile devices. We don't have the same resources, we don't have the same memory, it's not the same runtime. There's a lot of things that are very, very different apart from the programming language itself. So we wrote this extremely long article that we posted internally and said, okay, here's all the information from the platform team about all this stuff that we built up over the years, the things that you should avoid, the patterns that you should use on Android. And then we went to publish it externally, and it wouldn't fit anywhere because it was just too long. So we split it into 10 different articles that are posted on Medium. Each one of those 10 articles are not in themselves short. The introduction is, because it doesn't have any information in it. Everything else, fairly long. Please check it out. Go to medium.com. There's a Google Developers publication there, or it's published under my writing name there. It's all information that I think all Android developers should understand. It's a little bit hard to write rules for Android like it is, patterns for software development, like always do this. For example, just to pick a particular painful one out there, there's a rule in there saying avoid enums. Okay, that tends to be a trigger for some people. But that, like all of the rules in the document, are depending on your situation. What you need to do is understand why they can be bad. If you're writing a library and you have enums scattered within them, that may be bad for all the users that are using their library because they're all going to take the memory hit of that approach if there's a cheaper way to do what you wanted to do. If you use an enum in your application, I personally don't care. I don't think it's affecting anything. But you should understand when it can have impact. And you should understand the other things in those articles as well. Not all of the rules apply to all developers, but it's kind of good to get a sense for what the problems are as well as why. And then also come to the talk tomorrow if you can. There may be other interesting talks on at the same time. So Android for Java developers is basically going over some of those rules, specifically in memory. I only have an hour, so it's about a 3-hour talk where I had to do everything. So we'll just spend an hour talking about some of the memory concerns tomorrow morning. I would say go check out information about Marshmallow. Here's a couple of URLs to look at. Here's us, or me. And that's it. Thank you.